Thom Hartmann here with you. And, well, as Richard Nixon said, if the president does it, it is not illegal. Actually, if the president leaks, it actually isn't illegal. Maybe we should do something about that. There's something bizarre going on here. There's something very bizarre going on here that has to do with Donald Trump and his, I'm speaking obviously of his meeting with the Russian foreign minister and Russian ambassador, in which he apparently started bragging, and this story hit the news yesterday after we got off the air, as I recall, where he was bragging about, I get the best intel. I got the greatest intel. Oh, hey, you want to see some of the really cool intel I got? I mean, apparently that was the context, right? You know, and now he's, so then he sends 3 of his people out, including McMaster. I mean, you know, his director of national intelligence and his security chief, his CIA head. You know, he sends out all these poor schlubs who you know, are like at the highest level of the federal government and our intelligence to say, this was all done. Actually, I'm kind of conflating 2 stories. This also goes back to the, you know, why did he fire Comey story, the Clinton thing. But he sends out McMaster yesterday, who says, well, you know, the president did not compromise methods or persons. There's an actual technical phrase for it. I don't have the story in front of me here. I printed it, and I have no idea what happened to it. In fact, I'll bet it's actually in Victoria's News here. But in any case, he says, you know, he goes out and says, no, you know, first of all, yeah, McMaster, at no time were intelligence sources or methods discussed, and the president did not disclose any military operations that were not publicly known, said General McMaster. He called the Washington Post story false. And then Rex Tillerson said the same thing. He said that Trump talked about the nature of specific threats. That may come back to haunt him. But this is from Victoria Jones's newsletter. But according to the officials, Trump discussed the contents of the intel, not the sources and methods used to collect it. Now, in other words, he didn't say, you know, a spy named Victor in you know, some city in Syria told us that there's this group of ISIL guys who are planning to smuggle bombs concealed as batteries in laptop computers onto airplanes, because it appears that that's kind of the thing. You know, that's the you know, what they were actually discussing. Although a lot of this is speculation, we don't have the transcripts. So Tillerson comes out, McMaster comes out. One other, I think it might have been Sean Spicer, comes out and says, "Oh, you know, this is you know, you know, all a big, you know, not a big deal, and you know, he didn't really you know, release any important information, and you know, etc." But this one guy, Tom Bossert, who is the Homeland Security advisor, who was either in the room or knew people in the room, called the directors of the CIA and the NSA immediately after this meeting and said, "Oh my God, you know, Trump, you know, shared this information, you know, and it's not just he shared it with the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister. I mean, it could have been the Israeli ambassador and the Israeli foreign minister. It could have been the French ambassador and the French foreign minister. It doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter because, you know, we've got stuff going on with Russia right now, some good, some bad, but you know, there's certainly a lot of mixed stuff, shall we say, going on." But the bottom line is that Donald Trump seems to be like this child who, and he's releasing information that can be relatively easily, apparently, if this news reports are to be believed, the ones in the Washington Post and New York Times, can be reverse engineered to figure out who is that spy. Who is that guy who has embedded himself in ISIS and is sneaking us information, who Trump just outed? Now, Trump's defense is, hey, you know, I did this with foreign power that's working with us to try and stop ISIS. And, you know, truth be told, the Russians have a big ISIS problem too. But still, this is not, I mean, this is nuts. This is nuts. I think, you know, David Brooks, I've spent much of my, 14 years on this radio show, or thereabouts, 15 years on this radio show, actively disliking David Brooks. He's a conservative columnist who writes for the New York Times. And particularly during the Bush years, he was always, you know, out there defending Bush and the war and all this other kind of, it's just, but he has a column in today's New York Times, When the World is Led by a Child, that I think should provoke some serious thought for all of us. He says, mentally, Trump is still a 7-year-old boy who is bouncing around the classroom. Most of us, most adults have learned how to sit still. Trump's answers in these interviews are not very long, typically 200 words at the high end, but he will typically flit through 4 or 5 topics before ending up with how unfair the press is to him. His inability to focus his attention makes it harder for him to learn and master facts. And that's his first critique of Trump. His second, most people of drinking age have achieved some accurate sense of themselves. Trump apparently has none. I'm not quoting David Brooks here. This is just, you know, Trump is constantly looking for reassurance, constantly looking for reinforcement, constantly looking to people to tell him who he is. And, you know, we can play Sigmund Freud and say, oh, it's because his parents basically abandoned him when he was a child, but, and therefore he'd never really developed an internal sense of who he was, other than deference to authority figures, because he went to a military school as a child. But, I mean, he's, here, David Brooks, he says, in a short period of time, I understood everything there was to know about health care, he told Time magazine. A lot of people have said that. Some people have said it was the single best speech I ever made in that chamber, he told the Associated Press about his joint session speech. By Trump's own account, he knows more about aircraft carrier technology than the Navy. According to his interview with The Economist, he invented the phrase priming the pump. It was Franklin Roosevelt, actually. And he didn't invent it, he just popularized it in the context of economics. And then Brooks points out this, you know, Trump is not only trying to deceive others, his falsehoods are attempts to build a world in which he can feel good for an instant and comfortably deceive himself. I absolutely agree with this. Never thought I'd say that about a David Brooks column, but I absolutely agree with it. And I think it's something that we need to concern ourselves with, and we need to concern ourselves with seriously. Whether it's dementia or whether it is, and perhaps even just, you know, age-appropriate dementia, whether it's a guy who believes that your body is like a battery and it has a certain amount of power, and when you exercise too much, you know, Trump, now this is hitting the news, Trump has famously said some years ago, or wrote in one of his books, that all his friends who exercise a lot are having to replace their knees and their hips and things like that, and he's not going to do that because he's not going to subject his body to all that stress. He's not going to burn through it. And so exercise is like a bad thing because it burns you up. You know, it's just this weird stuff, right? So what this leads us to is the 25th Amendment. And the 25th Amendment it was passed in proposed in 1965, ratified in 67. And while there are some who think that its real genesis, its real origin, went back with the stroke that Woodrow Wilson experienced while he was in office, while he was president, or perhaps with the stroke that killed Franklin Roosevelt when he was president. But it having passed and been ratified in 67 might have had more to do with the assassination of Jack Kennedy. But whatever the genesis of the 25th Amendment, it's basically, it replaces the language in the Constitution about presidential succession. And it adds something quite significant. This is Section 4. Whenever the vice president, now, so this would require Mike Pence. He has to be the lead on this. Whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, and there, to the best of my knowledge, is no other body right now. So this would be the cabinet, the leaders of the executive offices. Whenever the vice president, a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments transmit to the president pro tem of the Senate, who I think is Orrin Hatch, yeah, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who's Paul Ryan, their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office of acting president. So the vice president, if the vice president can get the majority of the cabinet to sign a piece of paper saying Trump is not fit for office, then Mike Pence becomes president. Now, thereafter, if the president, now see, again, this was probably envisioned for strokes and heart attacks. Eisenhower had a heart attack in his last year in office too, in 1959. So, you know, who knows? But anyhow, but I think you can apply it to mental incapacity. Thereafter, when the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House his written declaration that no inability exists. In other words, hey, I've recovered from my stroke, said Woodrow Wilson, kind of thing. He shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the vice president and the majority of either the principal officers of the executive branch or the such body as Congress may provide transmit within 4 days to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Basically, their challenge, their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If the Congress, within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, determines by a 2/3 vote of both houses that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president basically becomes the president. So basically, you know, Pence and the cabinet could do this. If Trump fights back against it, Pence and the cabinet have to send another letter to Congress. Congress has 4 days to respond to this and to vote on it, and it takes a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate. So the bar is like super, super high here, particularly with Republicans in charge of the House and Senate. But is it time to start talking about the 25th Amendment?